Greetings, everyone. Today we will talk about fictional normativity. So, in philosophical discussions, we attribute such properties as normative and fictional to facts and statements. We also know that there are some normative statements, or maybe even facts, in fiction, such as Spider-Man did the right thing by saving a citizen. In the current speech, we aim to address whether normative properties themselves can be fictional in such statements. In other words, whether normative fantasy is possible. This issue was famously raised by Kendall Walton in his paper Morals and Fiction and Fictional Morality. Uh, he questioned why we resist imagining or even agreeing with cases like he murdered an innocent person for no reason and it was the right thing to do. This phenomenon was termed fictionality failure by another prominent researcher on this topic, Niels Hennes-Stier. Another source of inspiration for our inquiry is the work of philosopher Matthew Eklund, who in his book Choosing Normative Concepts raised the question of whether alternative normative concepts are possible. If they are possible, we reasoned, then there is a great chance that they are possible in fiction. Fiction is a product of imagination, and there is a stiff connection between imaginability and metaphysical possibility, which is not undoubted, however. Let's start with the problem as we see it. Suppose that an object X has a set of properties M. Among the properties of M are N, normativity, and phi, fictionality. Each property of that object can belong to one or several classes of properties. For example, normativity may belong to that class of accidental properties alpha, if n is not an essential property of the object X. In that case, we can ask ourselves following questions. Question first, does there exist a non-empty class of fictional properties phi? In other words, can the properties of objects be fictional? And question second, if the class phi is non-empty, can the normativity of the object X, denoted as Nx, belong to this class? Let's start. We started with question first. Can properties of objects be fictional? Because if the answer to this question is no, then with peace of mind, we can skip the following questions. Question first. Our assumption here is that properties can be fictional. It's an assumption because we can't prove it. However, we suppose that many people have strong intuitions that properties such as to be a dragon or to be the One Ring are fictional. Following this intuition, we want to clarify what it means for a property to be fictional as we see it. A property P of an object O is fictional, belongs to a class of fictional properties, if and only if the truth value of any proposition in which P appears as a predicate and O as the subject is determined by the content, structure, genre, artistic features, and the creation context, historical, cultural, etc., of a work of fiction. For example, the property to be a dragon is fictional because truth values of propositions like smoke is a dragon, the creature attacked the village is a dragon, etc., are determined by the pieces of fiction in which we found these propositions, The Hobbit or Skyrim, for instance. Objection first. For our answer, one can object that the truth values of propositions like the creature I saw yesterday isn't a dragon aren't determined by fiction. How is it possible if to be a dragon is a fictional property? One possible answer here is to distinguish the property to be a dragon, which we meet inside fiction, from the property to be a dragon, which we meet outside fiction. We see this as a pretty intuitive move, because to be a dragon in a reality is not the same as to be a dragon in a book. A book dragon can't interact with the physical reality the same way as a real dragon. That dragon can't destroy a real village or eat real people, at least we hope so. Hence, our answer to the objection is that the truth value of the proposition "the creature I saw yesterday isn't a dragon" isn't determined by fiction because it doesn't contain strictly the same property that proposition like "smoke is a dragon," despite the similarity of the structure of these properties. But what if we don't accept such a view on fictional properties? In that case, we can answer that there are two distinct tokens of the same property type to be a dragon, which are possessed by two different objects: smoke, which is a fictional object, and the creature I saw yesterday, which is not a fictional object. In the former case, the token of the property would be fictional; in the latter, the token wouldn't be fictional, respectively. Furthermore, propositions with each token of the property to be a dragon, in these cases, would have different conditions for the truth determination. In the first case, proposition would be determined by fiction. Objection second. Another possible objection is that truth values of some propositions are determined by some aspects of fiction, even though we wouldn't call properties in those propositions fictional. Take the proposition "Mona Lisa is a Renaissance painting." So, sure, the truth value of that proposition is determined by the historical and cultural context of that piece of fiction. But to be a Renaissance painting here is not a fictional property. Our answer here is that the truth value of the proposition isn't determined by the content of the painting. Fictionality, according to our characterization, requires truth value to be determined together by the content, structure, genre, and artistic features and the creation context, historical, cultural, etc., of a piece of fiction. Meaning that the content, as well as the context and a structure, etc., of a piece of fiction should determine its truth value. Question second. Let us move to the second question. If the class phi is non-empty, can the normativity of the object X belong to this class? We have to stress here is a can part, indicating that our question is about the possibility of that scenario. So another way to put it, bearing in mind our characterization of fictionality, is to ask: is it possible that there is a proposition in which to be normative, or its closest moral derivatives, to be right or to be good, would be the predicate, and the truth value of that proposition would be determined together by the content, structure, genre, and artistic features and the creation context of fiction? To answer this question, we have to understand the last part. What does it mean for the truth value of a proposition with a property as a predicate to be determined together by the content, structure, genre, and artistic features and the creation context of fiction? It does mean that there yes. It does mean that there are certain reasons in fiction to say so and not otherwise. There is a reason in The Hobbit for the proposition "smoke is a dragon" to be true. The reason can be straightforward author's statement in work. But let's imagine that there are no phrases like "smoke is a dragon" in The Hobbit. If so, there are other ways to determine the truth value of that proposition. What is a dragon according to Tolkien's books? For simplicity, let's say that according to Tolkien's books, dragons are creatures who can fly, emit fire, and have leather skin. Additionally, let's imagine from the plot of The Hobbit, we know that Smaug can fly, emits fire, and has a leather skin. From that, we can conclude that Smaug is a dragon is true. What we just did is break down the property to be a dragon into other simpler properties: to be able to fly, to be able to emit fire, and to have laser skin. All those properties by themselves are properties that can be found outside fiction, and that's how we know whether somebody or something possesses those properties or not. We know how it looks like to have lizard skin, we know how to determine whether somebody can fly, etc. But if so, what makes the property to be a dragon fictional? We know from the fiction that this specific combination of properties was introduced by Tolkien as a new compound property to be a dragon. Uh, that is why the piece of fiction determines whether Smaug is a dragon or not. Even though we know what is it like to have lizard skin and other dragon features from outside fiction, only from Tolkien's books, we can guess what is it like to be a dragon. If Tolkien decided that this list of features should be different in his book, our proposition Smaug as a dragon would have been false. As we have seen, there is a good reason to distinguish primitive and compound properties when we analyze the fictional properties. We find very persuasive the idea that some properties consist of others. For instance, the property to be a raven consists of other simpler properties like to have wings, to be black, to have feathers, etc. We also accept the thesis that some properties are primitive, meaning that they don't consist of other properties. Examples of primitive properties are to be true, to be possible, to be necessary, to be fictional, to be accidental, etc. So, answering the previously posed question, what does it mean for a truth value of a proposition with a property as a predicate to be determined together by the content structure, genre, and artistic features and the creation context of fiction? To determine the truth value of a proposition that contains a fictional property is to be a reason why the object has that property. One of the main reasons for that is that the property is made up by the authors in a certain way. So it is a combination of specific properties possessed by that object. As we can see, that works only for compound fictional properties. That's because there are no primitive fictional properties. At least we can't imagine any example of that. And he's hiding our argument against fictional normativity. Premise first, a property is fictional if and only if the truth value of any proposition that contains this property and the object having it is determined by the context, structure, genre, artistic features, and creation context of a piece of fiction. That's basically our definition of fictional properties. Premise second, the truth value of a proposition that contains a fictional property is determined by that the property is made up by the author in a certain way, so it is a combination of specific properties possessed by that object. Premise third, fictional property must be combined from other properties, be compound property. Premise fourth, normativity is a primitive property, not compound. Premise 5. The truth values of propositions that contain to be normative and its derivatives as a predicate can't be determined within the fiction. And conclusion, normativity can't be fictional. So we can conclude that if we find normativity in fiction, it's not a fictional normativity, it's just the normativity. So what about objections? One can argue that there exist primitive fictional properties. Take Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space. In that story, Lovecraft described the color which hasn't previously known to humanity. We can guess that to be color out of space is a primitive property. Answer. However, there is a problem. There is no real semantic content associated with this color as a color. The only thing we can say about it is that it's not like other colors, so it's not a primitive property. It's a conjunction of negations properties of the certain class colors. The colors out of space, if It's not red, it's not blue, it's not green, etc. Objection second, another objection that may be raised concerns the alternative truth. One can argue that there can be a fictional alternative truth. There are lots of different logical systems with different truth values, so what stops us from claiming that there can be another one but fictional? And if this is possible, what stops us from claiming that normativity can be fictional? Our answer, the problem with that objection is that if we give that alternative truth enough details, it would be just another version of truth. Maybe the correct one, maybe incorrect. There wouldn't be anything fictional in that version except the fact that it was presented in fiction. On the other hand, if we don't present enough details for that version of truth, it wouldn't be the truth, because we can't use it when we build our inferences. This means that the alternative truth can't play its functional role. Primitive properties are individuated by their functional roles. They can't be individuated by their parts like compound properties. So if the alternative truth can play its functional role, then we can't call it the truth. And another third objection may be the argument maybe about that our argument only works for metanormative cognitivism. And we could answer that that's right. However, we can reformulate our argument to meet the standards of non-cognitivism. Unfortunately, we don't have time to present the altered non-cognitivist version. All we can say is that we substitute the truth value with the fictional attitude in our argument. So, to conclude our speech, we can say that even though that fiction can contain normative statements, normativity itself cannot be fictional. That's why normative fantasy is impossible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.